The leaders of the American left are very confident in who's evil, anyone who opposes them. But they hold themselves to very different standards, maybe not surprisingly. Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, and Cory Booker have all stumped for votes at a church, for example, whose pastor says gay people are going to hell. Don't you try that at home. Chief Breaking News correspondent Trace Gallagher has more on this story. Hey, Trace.
Tucker, Victory Missionary Baptist Church is just a few miles from the Las Vegas Strip. It's been run by the Reverend Robert E. Fowler for years, and for years, Reverend Fowler's comments have been well documented. If you Google his name on page 1, you'll find the Reverend has said repeatedly, being gay is enough to send you to hell. Keep reading and you'll find that Reverend Fowler also believes homosexuality and child molestation are comparable sins. And yet, presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, both staunch supporters of LGBTQ rights, were front and center this week at Sunday services. Last month, Bernie Sanders held a town hall at the church. A California political science professor who's written about LGBTQ rights and religion and politics says, quote, no one is saying that you can't be an LGBTQ rights supporter and also visit houses of worship. But visiting a house of worship where the religious leaders are not supporters is a choice, and it sends a message that those views are not abhorrent. Cory Booker and Bernie Sanders haven't yet addressed the issue, but Kamala Harris' campaign told the San Jose Mercury News that her, quote, support and advocacy for LGBTQ equality has been unwavering throughout her career. She will continue to visit houses of worship across the country to address congregants about the pressing issues we face as a nation. Equality California, an LGBTQ rights group, says the candidate should have used the opportunity to educate the pastor on the importance of supporting the LGBTQ community. Reverend Fowler says the subject never came up. Tucker.
Trace Gallagher, thanks. They're such frauds. It's unbelievable. Stop judging other people. Maybe that's the lesson. Well, last week, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard attacked Kamala Harris's record on criminal justice because, again, it was fraudulent. Now she says Harris's entire campaign is built on a lie. This is an interesting story. Lisa Booth is a senior fellow at Independent Women's Voice, and she has more on it for us. Lisa, good to see you.
Hi, Tucker.
In what sense does Congresswoman Gabbard say Kamala Harris's campaign is entirely a lie?
It's about her criminal justice reform record, and I want to pull up a quote from Gabbard today that she tweeted out, doubling down. Here she says Kamala's entire campaign is based on a lie. That as Attorney General of California, she was a fighter for the oppressed and for criminal justice reform. But her criminal justice record shows that her policies exemplified the worst aspects of her criminal justice system. And she really put Senator Kamala Harris on blast last week in the second round of debates. Watch this.
She put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
So a pretty brutal line of attack. And Tucker, as you know, Senator Kamala Harris previously served as the Attorney General of California, as well as a district attorney of San Francisco. So Tulsi Gabbard there putting those policies on blast. And you had an opportunity to talk to Senator Gabbard after the debate. And for those at home who missed it, here's what she said.
She made decisions that ended up hurting people, that ended up hurting minorities, hurting poor people in the state of California, which is concerning to me for someone who wants to be the president of the United States and frankly, who's claiming to be a prosecutor president.
So there is Senator Gabbard laying out her concerns about Kamala Harris's record. And what's interesting, Tucker, if you go back to after the very first debate, Quinnipiac polled, and they found that Kamala Harris actually saw a bump because remember, she went after Joe Biden. She had a pretty aggressive line of attack there, and it was effective. And she was polling around 20%. So they just released a poll that has her at 7% overall. But the big surprise is that back in that July poll that I mentioned after the first debate, among black voters, she was polling at 27%. Now she's at 1%.
Wow. Fascinating.
Right.
Well, that had an effect. By the way, we should note that Tulsi Gabbard is not yet a senator. Unfortunately, Mazie Hirono is the senator one of them from Hawaii, but maybe she will be. Lisa, great to see you.
Thank you.
The war of words between Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard and Senator Kamala Harris continues to be one of the most talked about moments of last week's Democratic presidential debate. The Congresswoman from Hawaii took Senator Harris to task over her record as a prosecutor. And even after the debate, both lawmakers continued verbal sparring. In an interview with Anderson Cooper, Harris called Gabbard, quote, an apologist of Assad, referring to the embattled Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
She who has embraced and been an apologist for him in a way that she refuses to call him a war criminal. I can only take what she says in her opinion so seriously.
Honestly, it's pathetic that when confronted with the facts and the truth about her record that she claims to be proud of as a prosecutor, as Attorney General of California, all she can do is lob cheap smears.
A lot of people criticized Kamala Harris's Assad comments regarding Tulsi. Dennis Kucinich, who accompanied Congresswoman Gabbard on her trip to Syria in 2017, called the statement, quote, an admission that she was defeated by Gabbard in the debate. Joining us now via Skype to discuss all of this is New York journalist Michael Tracy. Welcome back, sir.
Great to be with you again.
So you wrote a piece about the build-up to this particular exchange. Give us the background.
Well, the background is that there was a conspicuous disparity in the way that Kamala Harris was portrayed in much of the prestige media versus how Tulsi Gabbard was portrayed. In January of this year, the New York Times did this sort of infographic where they summarized the main qualities of all the candidates who had announced at that point or were planning on announcing. And they highlighted the, quote, history-making potential for Kamala Harris on account of her unique personal traits, racially, etc., the fact that she was a female. And yet, that history-making potential was not touted for Tulsi Gabbard, even though she also obviously is a female, is a racial minority, would break all kinds of barriers, theoretically, were she be elected president. But for some reason, the media isn't inclined to herald that on Tulsi Gabbard's part because they have other political qualms with her. And so that dynamic really allowed Kamala Harris to get away with a lot of talking points and so forth over the course of several months, having to do with the impetus for her campaign that really hadn't gone challenged except for within certain parts of the niche media or certain online outlets now and then would call out her prosecutorial record. So what Tulsi Gabbard really did was directly challenge the core conceit of Kamala Harris's campaign by pointing out that this notion of her being a progressive prosecutor really can't be substantiated. In fact, being a progressive prosecutor is kind of an oxymoron. So that's why I think that the attack line was so effective.
It was particularly devastating, Michael, because I think it's just that Kamala Harris had not been challenged to the core on this. I mean, she was by a kind of like a befuddled Joe Biden who was trying to make the same point. But Tulsi Gabbard really just took her to task by point after point after point, particularly in the death penalty case. And she did not have a coherent response to that.
No. So in the previous debate, Kamala Harris was touted as having this breakthrough moment because she went after Joe Biden about an obsolete issue from 45 years ago, and Joe Biden, because he is sort of befuddled and probably in cognitive decline, couldn't respond competently. So it fell to Tulsi Gabbard really to take up the task and actually meaningfully challenge Kamala Harris on her own record. And I think, she did it in a way that people really responded to because they hadn't been exposed, for the most part, to any real critique of Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's why it kind of filled a void that had been waiting for somebody to capitalize on. And I think she was correct to discern that was a way for her to get additional notoriety in the public, and that's why I think she was, once again, the most Googled candidate on that night's debate.
Michael, we talked about this on the show here, too. I thought Kamala's response to Tulsi was cheap, lazy, and frankly cowardly. If you wanted to say that thing about Assad, you should have said it to her face when you were on the debate stage with her. I mean, what did you make of that response?
I saw your comments, Crystal, and I agree with you 100%. It's a total non sequitur, and it's a sleazy non sequitur. Even if you believe that Tulsi having met with Assad in 2017 is disqualifying for whatever reason, how is that responsive to Tulsi's criticisms of Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record? It's not in the slightest. It's the definition of a non sequitur, and yet that's all Kamala Harris could come up with, because whenever somebody wants to delegitimize Tulsi or distract from the substantive points that she raises, they simply bring up reflexively this Assad meeting. You might remember that Tim Ryan, the hapless congressman from Ohio, as I like to call him, at the previous debate, did the same thing when he had an exchange with Tulsi about whether to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Like Kamala Harris did after the debate, he issued the statement calling Tulsi an apologist for Assad, or whatever the precise label is.
Yeah.
So this is always done almost to the point where it becomes a mantra for not just politicians, but also journalists who haven't really taken the time to examine her record and what actually took place on that trip. You mentioned the quote that I got last week from Dennis Kucinich, who accompanied her on the trip, where he points out, in addition to that quote, that they met with opposition forces, they met with religious leaders. It was a fact-finding mission that used to be standard practice for members of Congress when they want to understand better the dynamics at play in fraught foreign conflicts. And yet that gets totally ignored by her detractors, who don't even bother to look at the record. I mean, when Tulsi Gabbard announced her campaign in January, I did a comprehensive look at her public statements, everything that she's really said about Assad, and I could come with no quote where she does anything that could be fairly characterized as apologizing for Assad or praising Assad, expressing kinship for Assad, etc. It does not exist. It's the refuge of the scoundrel, really, where if they want to ostracize her and stigmatize her and not respond on the merits to what she's actually saying. And Kamala Harris just followed in that disreputable tradition.
Well, Michael, it also raises the question of Kamala Harris. What do you think we should do about Assad? And if that's a very real question, right? It's like, well, okay, what are your foreign policy views on Syria? Do you think that we should have regime change? Do you want to have a debate about United States policy in that region? By the way, if any potential Democratic moderator is watching, I think we're all waiting for that question, not just on Afghanistan.
Very true.
Right. Foreign policy was really an afterthought in both nights of the debates this past week. I mean, Jake Tapper deigned to ask, one or two questions toward the tail end when, most people had tuned out of exasperation. But, the U.S. does have the most powerful military in world history and has troops deployed all over the world and is constantly threatening to initiate new wars. So I think it's kind of a legitimate area for inquiry, given that the president has essentially unilateral authority over military power. So I don't know. Yeah, just a recommendation to the later moderators. You might want to give it a little bit more attention. It's funny, I watched a debate from the 2007-8 cycle recently just to kind of refresh my memory with, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, Chris Dodd, John Edwards, Obama, etc. And about half of it was devoted to foreign policy because you had the Iraq War going on, you had the threatening of Iran, etc. But you mentioned Kamala Harris's ill-formed positions on foreign policy. Why hasn't anybody asked her to clarify these things?
Yeah.
As Dennis Kucinich just pointed out to me in the discussion that I had with him last week, Kamala Harris has gotten away with just kind of, making feints about what she may or may not believe about various hot-button foreign policy issues, but she's really skated without committing one way or another to a host of issues. And
well, Michael, she hasn't done all the polling there yet to figure out exactly where she stands. I'm curious really quick before we go. I mean, look, here's what I admire about Tulsi is there is nothing that requires more political courage than going against the military industrial bipartisan consensus in this town, which she has done with force. And whether you agree with her on absolutely everything or not, I really admire her courage in that department. And what's interesting to me is most of the, as you put it, prestige media, which I like that term, really seems to have a hard time wrapping their heads around the fact that maybe Tulsi's views come from like actual convictions. There's this whole, oh, is she a Russian plant? Or, you know, why are her views so weird, right? What's with her upbringing? And there's all this attempt to understand her rather than just maybe accepting the idea that a politician could be driven by principle and by what was, I'm sure, an incredibly searing experience serving as a combat medic in Iraq. I can't possibly imagine what she saw there.
It's funny. I went to the 538 live podcast in Detroit this past week. I don't know why I subjected myself to that, but I did for journalistic reasons. And one of the co-hosts, Claire Malone, didn't say anything, didn't offer any normative value judgments about any candidate, right, for the entire podcast, except when Tulsi Gabbard came up. And then a stern look came over her face, and Claire Malone said, no, she's a problematic person. And just like, okay, what exactly is problematic about her? Can you elaborate on that, or is that just some vague belief that you've been instilled with by the media portrayal over the past several months, where she's either a dictator apologizer, or she is a member of a cult, or she has some kind of nefarious connection to Russia that's never really quite fleshed out? So yeah, whenever a candidate challenges foreign policy consensus, and it's not unique to this cycle, although Tulsi has some unique qualities that make it extra egregious, but whenever a candidate challenges foreign policy consensus, they end up getting portrayed as somehow weird, or an oddball, or as somehow personally corrupt in a way that's never really quite defined. Dennis Kucinich had it happen to him, Ron Paul, etc., going back into previous cycles. So I think in the case of Tulsi Gabbard, the case is really harder to make because, as you mentioned, her military service equips her, if anybody, to level these criticisms. So that's why she's actually has a unusually solid grounding to make these points. And I think that's why a lot of the people are extra skeptical of the media narratives that have been grafted onto her, I think largely unjustifiably. Look, any candidate's record or his background is open to examination, but I find with her in particular, it's done so tendentiously and so dishonestly and lacks so much context that you have to wonder what the overriding motivation is. And I think a lot of it is rooted in the fact that people don't know how to deal with the fact that a candidate of her stature is actually challenging the core pretenses of American foreign policy on a bipartisan basis. So that's why she attracts the consternation that she does, I think, on a fundamental level.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, Michael. Great
Thanks,
to
Michael.
see you. Thank you.
We appreciate you joining us.
All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Next on Rising.